Hi, everyone. My name is Audrey Bomsey. I was the co-chair of the Palestine subcommittee for many, many years. Been active in Palestine solidarity work for about over 40 years. And I'm here welcoming everybody to this workshop. Clearly, genocide, tax resistance is an issue that a lot of people have been talking about. We've been out in the streets day after day, week after week, protesting the genocide in Gaza committed by Israel and aided and abetted by the US. We've been interrupting political events and speakers. We've been trying to get hundreds of local city councils to adopt ceasefire and US military aid resolutions. None of that has really mattered to our leaders. At most, they express kind of deep concern with what's going on, some maybe even outrage, but their actions, which speak louder than words, continue to be the same. They're getting ready to send another $18 billion to Israel on top of the 3.8 yearly billion dollars in military aid that gets sent. So I guess we have to question whether we're really living in a democracy. In any case, the war tax, genocide tax resistance is another way for us to protest, both individually and as a legal arm to the Palestine solidarity movement, which the Guild has always tried to be. I am going to introduce the speakers. We have a great panel today. The three speakers, Lincoln Rice, Peter Goldberg, and Suad Abdulaziz. Lincoln Rice received his bachelor's in accounting from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The same year he became a tax resister. That's in 1999. He earned his PhD in Christian ethics in 2013 from Marquette University and is published in the areas of Black liberation theology and social ethics. He's served as coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee since 2018. Peter Goldberger is a longtime active member of the National Lawyers Guild Military Law Task Force. He joined the Guild as a student in 1972. Actually, that's about the time that I joined it. Peter is a graduate of Haverford College and Yale Law School, where he studied civil rights law with Thomas Anderson and conspiracy law with Leonard Boudin. For about 40 years, Peter has practiced as a federal criminal appellate defense lawyer and is recently retired. Before entering private practice, he was a law professor at Villanova and then at Whittier Law Schools and a federal public defender. He resides in Pennsylvania. Suad Abdulaziz is a member of the Palestine subcommittee, which is sponsoring this. And she's a vice president of the National Lawyers Guild and is on the executive committee, our national leadership. She's a lawyer in Atlanta and has been working with the Stop Cop City movement. So we should get started. Suad, do you want to first present the context that we're going to be discussing tax resistance in?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. My name is Suad Abdelaziz. I'm here on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild Palestine Subcommittee, the committee coordinating this workshop. I'll speak briefly about the subcommittee. It is part of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee. The committee works to provide legal support to the movement for justice and liberation in Palestine. This includes working with BDS movements, challenging repressive legislation, supporting the right to organize, act, and speak on Palestine, advocating for Palestinian political prisoners, and challenging directly through briefs and reports US and Israeli violations of international law and Palestinian rights. If you'd like to join the Palestine Subcommittee, please email freepalestine@nationallawyersguild.org. I'll first start us off with some political context, and then I will hand it off to our partners at the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. As we are talking, you all are welcome to put questions in the chat, or you can hold off your questions until the end of the call. So let's get into it. Israel's invasion and unrelenting massacre of infrastructure and the captive Palestinian civilians in Gaza, whilst blocking humanitarian aid, is now internationally recognized as genocide. In January, the International Court of Justice announced provisional measures unanimously ordering Israel to cease blocking essential humanitarian aid, as well as ensuring with immediate effect that its military does not commit acts which constitute a violation of any rights of the Palestinians in Gaza as a protected group under the Genocide Convention. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese sent a warning to Israel's Western allies, putting them on notice of their complicity in genocide. While the ICJ, the International Court of Justice ruling on the merits of the case will take many more years, and the issue of whether there was complicity in a failure to prevent genocide will depend upon that judgment. Whilst that judgment is pending, the issuance of provisional measures by the court triggers the duty to cease support of Israel and prevent genocide. There is even greater responsibility for states like the US and others that have strong political ties to Israel and provide financial and military assistance. As we know, the US is the largest arms exporter globally, and particularly the largest exporter to Israel, providing the bulk of the arms and billions of dollars in aid that are facilitating the genocide in Gaza. Israel has received more US military aid and more US aid of any type than any other country since World War II. This military assistance and financial aid, unlike US aid to other countries, is unconditional. The US has now deployed over 1,000 troops to Gaza to support the ground invasion, including special ops forces. It is illegal under international law to aid and abet the commission of genocide. This applies to both states and to individuals. As the US is a signatory to both the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention, it has a legal obligation to prevent the commission of genocide and to prevent and punish the commission of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, not aid and abet. Under the Rome Statutes, individuals risk facing criminal and civil liability under international law for aiding and abetting genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and may face investigation and prosecution at the International Criminal Court and in third states under the principle of universal jurisdiction. In November, the National Lawyers Guild, along with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal, issued a letter to congressional representatives notifying them of this liability. Not only is our state committing serious breaches of international law in its assistance of Israel, but it is also in violation of its own domestic laws. US laws prohibit military assistance and weapons sales to countries engaged in rights abuses under the Leahy laws. Furthermore, Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act prohibits weapons sales to countries restricting US humanitarian assistance. Just this week, Israel launched targeted missiles at a clearly marked aid truck delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance, killing aid workers. Significantly, in January, a US federal court in the Northern District of Florida issued an order concluding that Israel's assault on Gaza is in fact a plausible case of genocide and imploring the Biden administration to stop its unflagging support for Israel's ongoing siege of the Palestinian people in Gaza. The US federal court stated, "It is every individual's obligation to confront the current siege in Gaza." Despite these measures, the US is flooding arms to Israel in order to support the invasion of Gaza. In the past month, over 100 separate arms deals have been made. Just yesterday, the US sent new arms, including fighter jets and 2,000-pound bunker bombs. These arms transfers are made without any public debate because each fall under the specific dollar amount that requires the executive branch to individually notify Congress. Publicly, US officials are concealing the sales whilst performatively decrying the civilian casualties in Gaza. The US is attempting to play the role of both the instigator and the mediator. This strategy of duplicitous US foreign policy and militarism are implemented throughout the sudden coups that many African nations are facing. In the Congo, Niger, and Burkina Faso, US foreign policy and militarism are central in efforts of concerted destabilization. In Sudan, where I'm from, the largest mass displacement of a peoples today is taking place due to a foreign-backed militia taking over the country. The militia is also diverting aid, which has led to widespread starvation. The US is supporting the militia strategically, financially, diplomatically, and of course, with arms, all whilst obscuring and concealing this support and publicly mediating this tragic two-sided conflict. We are too familiar with this narrative. The American public does not have a say in these concealed policies. The mass of dissenting voices has been silenced in this country. Polls show that a majority of people in this country demand a ceasefire. One way in which the masses have made their voices heard is through civil disobedience and direct action. This includes civilian blockades to stop shipments, freedom flotillas to deliver aid, and the good old American tradition of tax resistance. Globally, activists are launching campaigns around no tax for genocide and refusing to give their tax dollars to aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza. UK organizers have made the legal argument that whilst there is a pending case of genocide against Israel at the International Court of Justice, individuals who contribute to military support of Israel through their states are culpable under international law of aiding and abetting genocide. It is therefore their legal duty, they argue, to omit payment to their state for said military support. It is the role of activists at this time to support mass movements. One way we can do so as a guild is educating ourselves and understanding the risks involved in tax resistance, arguments around it, and relaying this information. With that, I'll hand it off to our esteemed partners with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Thank you so much for being with us today, Lincoln and Peter, and for educating advocates.
Thank you so much. Yeah. All right. So yes, I want to first thank the Guild for asking to have this in very important session. And again, and if you missed the intro, my name is Lincoln Rice with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Joining me for this part of the discussion will be Peter Goldberger, who has been a legal counsel to Nutric almost since its beginning in 1982. So very esteemed thanks to Peter for Peter's role with Nutric. But I'm going to share my screen, and I have a presentation to go through. So the theme here, we won't pay: war tax resistance and resisting U.S. militarism. So some important disclaimers. That some methods of tax resistance are not legal. Anyone who practices them is practicing a form of civil disobedience with associated risks. We're going to be sharing, we'll be sharing not only what the law is, but what the practice of the government has been with certain forms of resistance, realizing that government policies and laws do change. We're not trying to give tips or gimmicks on how to fudge or cheat to reduce or avoid taxes. It's more just to provide a wisdom that that war tax resistors have garnered over decades of practice. And then lastly, normally someone giving this might say they're not an accountant. I have my bachelor's in accounting, but I must admit I only worked as a tax person one season in the late 90s. Otherwise, I've worked as a bookkeeper, and I'm not a CPA, so I'm not really here as an accountant. And truthfully, everything I learned while I was getting my bachelor's, none of what I'm talking about today was covered. The assumption was you're preparing people's taxes and they're going to pay them. They never discussed what would happen if someone you were filling out taxes for said, I'm not going to pay. Most accountants have no idea what could happen if you suggest that to them. But I'm also not a financial advisor or a lawyer, but I'm here more to share, again, decades of experience from people who have been war tax resistors.
So let me say, as Peter, that I am a lawyer,
yes.
And I have spent many decades as a significant part of my volunteer and pro bono work, assisting, counseling, and occasionally defending people who have participated in nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action of various kinds, including tax resistance through Nutric. And in some criminal cases, anti-government tax protesters who may engage in some of the same kind of activities that we'll be talking about, but from a very different motivation and background. So that's part of what I bring.
Thank you. So you heard Peter use the word Nutric, and that's what we call for short the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, because that's a mouthful. We've been around since 1982. We were started by local groups, organizations, and individuals who wanted to have more of a national information clearinghouse for war tax resistance, so that a group in LA wasn't repeating this, the same creation of materials as a group in New York and Chicago and Milwaukee and et cetera, et cetera. So you may notice if you do more searching that there are certain local groups across the country. It's not like they are our franchisees or anything. We actually answer to them. They're kind of the mainstays, and we're here as a point of contact on the national level so that groups can keep in touch. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these first slides, but just as background, if you're here, you probably are aware of this, that the United States spends more on its military than any other country in the world, by far. Also, when it comes to how our budget is, how we dedicate our federal budget, if we remove those trust funds of Social Security and Medicare, for a regular employee, their taxes that are due on April 15th, normally between 40 and 50% of those funds are dedicated to past and current military expenses.
Obviously, past expenses because that's where a lot of the national debt comes from.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so a significant portion of the national debt is because of that. People resist taxes for a number of reasons. Obviously, the main touchstone recently is the invasion of Gaza using U.S. weapons or weapons purchased with U.S. funds. But there are a number of reasons people have been resisting taxes for war in the United States. Here on the right, you can see part of what's called the 1033 program, where local police departments can purchase military-grade weapons, either at a very reduced price or for free. So this is from Lakeland, Florida, where they were able to obtain a tank from the U.S. military, but also the impact on the environment. The U.S. military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world, yet environmental agreements like the Paris Climate Accord exempt military emissions from any of their benchmarks. So that's not included in trying to get to a more ecologically friendly place.
So
I'm not going.
We might throw in quickly, Lincoln, that not missing from the list that you just posted is a very significant group, which are by no means the majority of the people, but are a significant source of the energy behind Nutrik, which is religious pacifists.
Yes, it's definitely a mix. There are many folks who've been the mainstays of Nutrik who either come from Quaker, Mennonite, Peace Church backgrounds, but there are also folks who are less religiously inclined, who maybe come from a more War Resisters League background, and it's a big tent, but they have been a mainstay. I just want to touch on two of these, but it seems oftentimes if we have enough knowledge about a civilization, we may be able to find an instance of war tax resistance. So one of the earliest recorded instances of war tax resistance in what is now the United States goes back to the 17th century, when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for a Dutch fort. More recently in Myanmar, sometimes referred to as Burma, back in 2021, when there was a military takeover of the country, millions of people in Myanmar refused to pay their utility bills because it's a state utility, and that was one of the main ways that the military government was supporting itself. And so there, unlike I'd say in the United States, the risk was much greater and has been much greater. People who refuse to pay the utility bills have often had armed military troops come into their homes demanding payment of the utility bills. So which tax resistance method is right for you? This can always be looked at from a couple different perspectives. For some folks, a possible turnoff to war tax resistance is it can seem complicated because taxes are complicated. There's no cookie cutter way to do it. But on the other hand, there's a lot of adaptability. So if someone is willing to take the time to really examine their values, what they're hoping to achieve, and the risks associated with each method, you can really adapt a method of war tax resistance that's right for you. So again, there's no one way. It's varied depending on your situation. But you could say that essentially war tax resistance falls under two larger umbrellas of methods. The first one is the civil disobedient method, method of civil disobedience that is illegal, and that is if you're going to refuse or pay all or some of your federal income taxes. Essentially, if you owe any taxes and you're not paying them, whether you file a return or not, that is an act of civil disobedience. It is against the law. There are potential risks. The only legal method would be to earn less than the taxable, earn less than the amount you'd need to owe a taxable income. So essentially, for most people, that's equivalent to the standard deduction in a given year. So for 2024, the current tax year we're in, the standard deduction for a single person is $14,600. For a married couple, it's $29,200. Granted, depending on your situation, there could be tax deductions or tax credits that would increase the amount that you could make without owing any income taxes. So for some folks, they choose the more simple route, or earning less, because it goes along with their values of wanting to live simply and have less of an environmental impact on the planet. So next, I just wanted to touch base on, what are usually the two more common ways of having an income that's taxed. One is being an employee, followed by if you are self-employed. So if you're an employee, that means federal taxes are withheld from your paycheck. You get a W-2 at the end of the year that shows how much was taken out in federal, possibly state income taxes, Medicare, Social Security, etc. So if you're in this situation, you might think that you're in this situation where, well, the money's already taken out, I get a refund every year. But you may recall that your first day of work, or when you first accepted the position, your current job, they gave you what was called a W-4 form, which it's an IRS created form that between you and it never gets turned into the IRS, or rarely. It's more meant for the IRS creates it so that you can tell your employer how much you want in federal income taxes removed from each paycheck. So most people just kind of sign their name. It's kind of complicated and people don't know how to fill it out most of the time. And I'm not going to, in here with our limited time, talk about how to fill it out because it won't apply to everybody. But I'll put the resource in the chat later on, but it's also on the screen. If we have a page on our website, nutric.org/W-4, where we have a more in-depth 8-page booklet, a flyer, 1-page flyer, 2-sided, and a 10-minute video, each of them for kind of different learning styles and how much you want to take a deep dive, explaining how to adjust your W-4. So at the very least, if now you get a refund but wanted to stop giving a free loan to the federal government all year, this could actually be helpful in telling you how to adjust your form correctly so that at the end of the year you neither owe nor will get a refund, but it also gives you the option to make the decision next April 15th if you want to pay your federal income taxes or not. Technically, what they would call inflating your W-4, it is an illegal act. It is punishable by up to a $100,000 fine and a year in prison. But this is one of those things where there's the letter of the law and the practice. And since 1975 was the last time that a war tax resister went to prison for inflating their W-4. This practice kind of became more popular during the latter half of the Vietnam War. And there were a number of more prominent war tax resistors who went to jail for 9 months to a year for doing this. But if anything, it perhaps just raised awareness of this method, and they haven't been criminally prosecuting anyone for doing this now for many decades.
As with almost everything else that we're talking about and that Lincoln mentions, there are criminal penalties and there are civil penalties, and in the tax code. So while it's difficult to tempt a federal prosecutor into bringing a W-4 fraud case, and would require probably a knowing dishonesty, a lying on one of the questions, not a disagreement about the level of withholding that you want to trigger. That's not to say that you couldn't get a civil penalty for even making an error that not made in good faith, I suppose, in the filling out of the form.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. And I'll be touching on this more as we move forward, but there is the IRS has essentially a civil division and a criminal division. Anything that falls under collection or trying to collect, or usually most fines and penalties fall under the civil arm of the IRS. And then there's the criminal division where they would be actually charging you with a crime, which we'll be getting to a few instances of that later on so that we, again, know what levels of risk are associated with different things. Self-employed. So if you're self-employed, you're a contractor or a consultant, nothing is withheld from your paycheck. Depending on if you do work for a company that is required to report, if you make more than $600, they may send you and the IRS a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation form. If you get it, you know the IRS got it. If you do work maybe for, if you're a carpenter and you do work for families, then your reporting of income to the IRS is more on the honor system. But in both cases, you're expected to pay quarterly taxes. Nothing's withheld, including Social Security and Medicare, from any of your payments. So when it here, you're really more in control of what you want to pay. Certain war tax resistors, if they're in this situation, may also choose to resist Social Security and Medicare because different administrations have borrowed from it in the past, but they do have to pay it back. So in my experience, many, or perhaps even most war tax resistors in this situation will pay their Social Security and Medicare, but refuse to pay all or a portion of the other part of the federal income tax. There's also a growing situation with the gig economy, where, for example, if you are an Uber driver, you're not actually doing contract work for Uber. Uber is just kind of a pass-through entity that lets you know of work and holds the money temporarily. So you might receive a 1099K. Essentially, the 1099K is for any time a business transaction happens and a third party is holding the money for a certain period of time. So that happens with Uber. It happens if you sell things on eBay. Even if you're not using a company like that, but if you are a masseuse and you collect payments through PayPal, if you do business transactions through PayPal and you do enough of them, you might also get this 1099K. For tax year 2023, the reporting requirements were very high. You needed to have at least $20,000 worth of business income and at least 200 transactions. For our current tax year, they've dropped it to $5,000. And starting next year in 2025, they'll bring it in line with regular self-employed folks, where if you make $600 on eBay, even if maybe you have a net loss, but you still, it doesn't mean that's your net income. It just means you made that amount of gross income and it'll be reported. So there might be a bunch of folks who are used to not having income reported at currently that are in the gig economy that'll see that income reported in the near future. There's also the situation of filing taxes versus not filing. One is you're kind of more in the open, and the one you're a bit more hidden. And so there could be, legitimate reasons for going in either direction. So with filing, if assuming you're sending an accurate form, you know that they accurately know what your tax debt is. It also, especially if you paper file, it gives an opportunity to send a letter of protest and let someone know who will read your letter why you are refusing to pay all or a portion of your federal income taxes. It does make IRS collection a little bit easier because before they can start collection proceedings, they have to assess a tax debt. So if you don't file, as we'll get to shortly, they'll have to file for you. And that's another step that the IRS may or may not get to. An advantage to filing is once your tax return is processed and they assess the tax debt, it begins a 10-year statute of limitations. And so as long as you filed accurately, after 10 years, they can no longer use their civil arm or to try to collect or charge you with any crime using their criminal arm. The debt disappears. It can also make it easier to apply for scholarships, health insurance subsidies, etc. You don't have to pay federal income taxes to qualify for student loans or health insurance. But when it comes to student loans, most student loan officers want to verify income by looking at filed forms. It's not required to get student loans, but depending on who you're working with at the student loan department, they may be more or less flexible in verifying your income in other ways. When it comes to the health insurance subsidies, otherwise known as Obamacare, you're actually required to file married jointly if you're married in order to receive those subsidies. So there it is. It kind of sucks you into filing even if you'd rather not. With not filing, you do not send forms to the IRS, though we'd still recommend you fill out the forms and keep the records yourself, because at some point the IRS may file for you, and especially if you are collectible and they start collecting money, they'll usually file in such a way that they overestimate the tax due. So you might, if you're collectible and they start collecting money, you'll want to amend your return, but you'll need proof that your tax debt should be lowered. It makes the IRS. Oh, sure.
Lincoln, can I just say something about the questions and answers? People are posting questions in the chat, possibly also in the Q&A session. Lincoln and I are not seeing those questions at this point and are expecting to do Q&A at the end. But if the moderators do see a question that's in the nature of clarification or that they think would facilitate what we're doing right now, by all means, bring that to our attention, because otherwise we're not going to see questions as we go along.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. So with not filing, it makes collection more difficult for the IRS because, again, they have to realize that you didn't file, and someone will then have to take the time to file before they can move on to collection proceedings. So it is a way that many people fall through the cracks. It's not, it says no statute of limitations, but it's a exaggeration. Essentially, it won't start until the IRS files for you and assesses the debt. So again, it could delay that statute of limitations. And there is an additional penalty for doing so. So just to be aware of those types of things if you are choosing not to file. On the latter half of this presentation, I'm going to mention some myths about war tax resistance, then what's most likely, and then finish with some resources. So probably the biggest myth that I hear regularly is that I'm going to go to jail. And so very few war tax resistors have gone to jail in modern times. As I mentioned, there were some in the early 70s that did a short stint in prison for W4 resistance. In the last, especially 25, 30 years, it's been really the only people who have been criminally charged and then did jail time were those who falsified forms, filed fraudulent forms, either understated income purposefully or took deductions that they were not supposed to take. The one exception is Tony Serra from 2005. He's more of a activist lawyer in the San Francisco area who the IRS wanted to make more of an example of. And so they charged him with simply not paying. So simply not intentionally not paying a federal income tax is something that someone could go to jail for. When it comes to war tax resistors, it's a very rare thing to be criminally prosecuted for. And perhaps him being a lawyer led to, them having a more successful case against him.
I believe he also had 2 prior tax convictions.
Yeah. And then in case anyone's curious, I put in the chat that we have on our website. It's under the frequently asked questions, but I've saved you the navigational aspect of it. A list going back to World War II of every single war tax resistor who's been brought to court and what happened with their case, whether they actually did jail time or didn't do jail time. And so if you happen to look at that list later, you'll see that the last person to be brought to court as a war tax resistor was in 2013. And that was someone who had filed fraudulent forms. So in the really past, after 2000, the folks who've filed fraudulent forms and did some jail time, in almost all instances, were not aware of Nutric until after the fact when they had been criminally charged and then found us. And unfortunately, if they had known about us beforehand, it might have influenced the type of resistance that they chose, the method they chose to take.
I think it might be wise to underscore here, Lincoln, that we are talking specifically about war tax resistors, people who have refused to pay some or all of their taxes or otherwise comply with the tax law because of their objection to all war or to a particular war. And not to any other politically motivated anti-tax or tax protest individuals, because lots of right-wing tax protesters were prosecuted and did go to jail in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, motivated in various other ways, in what might seem like similar conduct, but differently motivated. So it seems interesting that the IRS and the Department of Justice have had an unstated prosecution discretion policy that is more favorable to war tax resistance. Now that may be because the war tax resistors tend to be honest, which is tends to be a significant protection against prosecution, open and honest about what they're doing, and not to be violent in their rhetoric or associated activities, which are big no-nos for getting in trouble with the government.
Yes, thank you. And I'll note, Peter used that term tax protester, which is a legal term that's been used in courts when those folks have been prosecuted. Tax protesters are usually more of a libertarian bend, and they usually have some understated argument that the U.S. Collection of federal income taxes is not constitutional, which definitely seems to ruffle the ire of the IRS.
And a lot of other arguments, one after another, as each one is shot down.
Yeah, so they definitely don't appreciate that. I think also our honesty in letting folks know and always stating up front that this is an illegal action to refuse to pay has been one of the reasons that Nutric hasn't been the subject of criminal charges. Another myth about war tax resistance is the IRS will take my house, my car, my property. Actually, if I was giving this talk in 1995, that wouldn't be a myth. That actually was much more common. So you can see a graph here using IRS data of seizures going back to 1987. So we see that the IRS in the mid to late 90s had a change in practice where they decided to not seize property to the degree that they had been before. So if you were a war tax resistor in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, you probably, if not yourself, knew someone who had at least had a car taken, and there were instances of homes being taken. But again, the laws on the books, those things could start happening tomorrow. It's more of a policy change, not a law change. And now it seems to be something at the moment that's saved for the rich. And so we haven't heard of a war tax resistor have a piece of property seized since 1997. And as you can see there, before 1998, the IRS was regularly seizing 10,000 plus pieces of property a year. Since then, the number has hovered between 50 and 400 pieces of property a year.
And I would speculate that the main reason for that is it generates bad publicity, and they are very sensitive to public perception of their fairness and being whether they are bullies, because the functioning of the tax system totally depends on massive high levels of voluntary participation and cooperation. And when people have a bad reaction, as they would when they see a neighbor's property being seized or hear about it, it produces bad feelings, needless to say.
I'd agree with that. I think there are some high profile.
They do not publicize what the rationale is behind their enforcement priorities, obviously, but I think that's a reasonable interpretation.
Yes, definitely. Another myth, the IRS will just end up getting more money in the end, especially when you add in penalties and interest. And so this is from the IRS itself, where they state that in a given year, what they call the gross tax gap, or the difference between what they believe is actually owed them and what is actually paid them, is close to $500 billion. Granted, obviously, most of this money is not from war tax resistors, but from others who are circumventing the payment of federal income taxes. They also have stated that when it comes at the end of the day, of that $458 billion, they expect to collect about $52 billion. So roughly 13%. So again, the IRS definitely is still active in their collection processes, but it is a net where many fall through and never see any collection efforts, or at least don't see it until they reach Social Security, which we'll get to shortly. And so it is, again, most of the money that's for whatever reason not paid to the IRS is never paid to the IRS. Another myth is war tax resistors don't pay for things our society needs. So unlike the tax protester who is trying to come up with some false legal argument in order to keep the money for themselves, it's a practice among war tax resistors to redirect funds to groups and organizations that they believe are doing good work, but could do more of that if they had the funds. So it's a common practice either on an individual or communal level to redirect to groups usually in your area, or it could be globally. There's obviously a lot of options there, but there also are in the New England area, in the San Francisco, Oakland area, there are two large, what we call alternative funds that have collective redirection ceremonies each year around tax day. And each year, both of them redirect usually tens of thousands of dollars to groups and organizations that they believe are doing good work. So what are the actual risks? Well, first, letters. You definitely, especially if you file, you will receive lots of letters, some of them certified. It's a very effective method for the IRS in collection. They have stated that 50% of overdue taxes have been paid simply because they sent a letter that scared the person. So whenever you get that letter from the IRS, somehow it's built into our DNA that your heart will skip a beat. So you'll get these computer generated letters. Next, the most common actually is a Social Security garnishment. That is something that it's a lot easier for them to do than other types of collection because it's another federal agency. Usually within about a year of applying for Social Security, they'll start taking 15%. They could take more in certain instances, but that would require the approval of additional bosses at the IRS. So it's very rare, but so normally it's set at 15%. Sometimes a salary garnishment may happen. That's been relatively rare the last 10 years. In the last 6 years that I've been the coordinator for Nutric, maybe I'll hear of one or two folks in our network each year who have a salary garnishment. It's a lot more intensive for the IRS to do. If that would happen, people are allowed take home of $1,250 if they're single, $2,500 if they're married, and then it increases if they have children. And by take home, I mean literal take home after health care and other taxes and items are withheld either voluntarily from their paycheck or they're required to pay into them. Bank seizures are also uncommon, but they do happen from time to time. Oftentimes when I do hear about a bank seizure, the person may have been a war tax resistor for 7 or 10 years. The IRS knew about this account because it was either an interest-bearing account or something that they had used to receive a refund one year. But it's just the IRS might get around to doing that. They may not. State refunds, they're actually halfway decent if you overpay your state taxes and collecting that. I should mention with things like state refunds, bank accounts, this would also include retirement funds, which they usually don't go after right away. They may go after that, especially if other methods have been unsuccessful. But when it comes to bank accounts or types of funds like that, they can take the entire amount up to the amount of the tax due. So it's different from like a salary garnishment where they need to leave you a certain amount of take home.
Lincoln, was that take home over what period of time? Is that a weekly, a monthly, or what is that?
Sorry.
No,
If I didn't state it.
you didn't. Yeah.
Okay, it's per month. $1,250 per month for a single person and $2,500 per month as for a married couple.
Thanks.
Thank you. Interest and penalties. Normally, especially during that 10-year statute of limitations period, you can expect, as a general rule of thumb, your tax debt to double. So if you're resisting $1,000 over the course of 10 years before it expires, could go up to 2,000, and 100 would go up to 200, and so on. We already mentioned loss of health insurance subsidies. Again, if you don't, you're required to file to obtain those. Difficulty in getting student loans we talked about. Notice of a public lien. Once you owe about $20,000, you will, they're usually pretty good at sending a notice of a public lien to your county courthouse. The most common effect that this would have would be if you were a homeowner and you're going to sell a home. Essentially, it'll tell the bank, who will probably check with the county to see if you have any debts, to pay the tax debt amount to them first before you get the remainder of the funds. So this main effect is transactions that would go through the county courthouse. Sometimes when that happens, they've also reported to the credit reporting agencies and it's affected people's credit. But when I've checked with folks over the last 5 years who have public liens, if their credit has been affected, it hasn't affected their credit at all. But again, that policy could change in the near future. The last thing that they have been decent at performing is also regarding passports. If you have what the IRS considers a seriously delinquent tax debt, which for tax year 2024 is $62,000, it goes up every year with inflation. If your tax debt reaches that amount, they'll send a notice to you that they contacted the State Department and that you're not allowed to renew or obtain a new passport. So that's a newer law. It went into effect in 2018. We're not sure if it's constitutional or not. There hasn't been someone with money who's actually appealed this law. But folks in our network who are over that amount have received this notice. If you have a passport, you're able to use it until it expires, but then you would not be able to renew your passport. So for those that either love to travel or need to travel for something like work, you might want to make sure that the tax debt never goes over that amount. Very near the end here, so you may have a faint memory that early on in the Biden administration, the IRS received funding of $80 billion over 10 years. This would be huge for them. It would double their workforce over 10 years and bring their funding levels and workforce levels back to where it was 10 years ago, when truthfully the IRS wasn't that effective then, which just talks about how they've been neglected by Congress the last 10 years. But we've already seen this be partially gutted during the last 2 times that there were arguments over raising the federal the spending limit, the debt ceiling. In order to reach a compromise, the Republicans made sure that some of this money was gutted. So whether the IRS actually gets the majority of this money or not will largely depend on what happens in November. So again, Newtrick is definitely, we're here to be a resource. All of our materials are available for free on our website. We have a newsletter that has stories, but also latest updates about what the IRS is doing that could affect war tax resistors. Our newsletter goes out every 2 months. We have a regular blog, tax day activities. Essentially, it's a huge website. Hopefully, if from this session today, you can kind of guide yourself to sections of it that might be more useful for you. And then I just want to lastly just share this resource list. I'll put this in the chat shortly, but our website, the W4 website, we also have a list of contacts and counselors who, local contacts and counselors. These are war tax resistors who've gone through some extra training and are listed by state on that page. So if you wanted to connect with someone locally to talk about war tax resistance more and what might be right for you, feel free to contact someone on that list. Newsletter sign up. And lastly, there's the war tax
Well,
resistance.
let me underscore, Lincoln, that the NUTRIC model for the whole 40 years of its existence has been based on a peer counseling model, not a lawyer, professional, top-down kind of counseling model. And that almost all counseling of war tax resistance for clarification of goals and selection of strategies and methods that are best for the individual are done on a very personal and not a legalistic basis.
Thank you. Yes. And so lastly, this war tax resistance penalty fund, we host them on our website, but they're separate from NUTRIC. But they're essentially a mutual aid organization. They actually started the same year as NUTRIC in 1982. But their role is that if someone is one of those unlucky few who is collected upon, they'll pass the hat. And it's not to reimburse for the tax itself, but for the added kind of hit of the interest and penalties. So you just, if you are collected upon, we urge people to contact them. They'll pass the hat around. And with the number of folks that are a part of that mutual aid group, normally 3 or 4 times a year when there are people being collected upon, it hasn't been common lately, but if everyone's willing to throw in around $25, it's usually able to reimburse the interest and penalties for usually more than one individual if that has happened at that time. So again, if we want to, it's a very personal decision to become a war tax resistor and how you want to practice it for your own situation. But we're also around for, as Peter mentioned, peer counseling to support each other and to support each other financially when the need arises.
Okay. Want to thank all of the 3 speakers. This has really been a fantastic panel. You can tell that others think that way, that almost everybody has remained on the, has remained online for this whole time. We're going to have a question and answer.
So Audrey, before we do that, may I suggest that can I throw out from a lawyer's point of view a few other topics?
Oh, sorry.
That not so much from the,
Okay,
focused on
sorry.
what Lincoln led on.
Definitely, that we're counting on that.
Yeah. So I first want to say that I am, happy to talk and through Q&A or just to introduce now the notion of lawyers who may not, and I assume most of the people in the audience in the NE Guild event are themselves lawyers. I know we would have law students and legal workers also participating, may be interested in providing counseling and support to others who are moved to consider tax resistance, but not to participate in it directly themselves. And I know there was some concern expressed in the discussions leading up to today about whether there's some ethical restriction on giving advice to people who are talking about engaging in illegal activity. And I want to say that that is, if done professionally, is not an ethical concern. It's certainly been a significant part of my practice for the last 40 years. And I don't think anyone has suggested that my practice is other than entirely ethical. What it means is to counsel people is, for me, is I always say, as a lawyer, I recommend that you do not break the law. As a lawyer, I recommend that if you are deeply moved to break the law for some reason, that you do it with your eyes open and with full awareness of the consequences that may befall you and the benefits that it may bring to you in terms of your conscience and your self-esteem. And many have engaged in civil disobedience and direct action of various kinds, knowing full well that it's illegal, including some lawyers participating, because they've balanced the benefits that they perceive to come to them from doing what they believe to be the right thing against the risks and consequences of engaging in illegal action, and helping people make those decisions, as long as you don't aid and abet the commission of a crime by recommending it or suggesting a way of carrying it out that that is entirely proper within the realm of legal counseling. I mean, even in ordinary criminal practice, people want to know, where is the line between legal and illegal activity? And if you can't talk to people who are thinking about, you may recommend that people not go up to and put their toe right on that line in one context or another, but people may want to go right up to the line, and they're legally entitled to go right up to the line. That's what it means for the law to draw a line, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said. And so, telling people about that is perfectly valid form of legal counseling. Now, to a lawyer who may engage in non-payment of taxes, again, that's actually, I think we all probably know, a very common circumstance, usually not for good reasons, but just for selfish or careless reasons. And very few get in trouble, maybe with the IRS, rarely with the bar, and almost never prosecuted. But as Lincoln mentioned a few minutes ago, the chances of being prosecuted for doing any given thing, if you are a lawyer, is higher than doing that same thing if you're not a lawyer. And I think that's true of other professionals as well. I mean, the ratio of dentists and accountants and lawyers who don't pay their taxes and wind up being prosecuted is higher than of other professions. But the tradition that, and just to circle back right to the very beginning of what Lincoln said and then open it up to the Q&A, is there is a historic tradition of people being motivated by opposition to all war or to particular wars in American history, going back at least to the Revolutionary, not only probably to the Revolutionary War era, but certainly the most famous instance to the Mexican War in the 1840s of Thoreau and the other transcendentalists. This is a respected, honored piece of American law reform protest tradition in the civil disobedience category. It's not new. And the last thing I wanted to say is, though, because it's not new, some of the legal or legalistic arguments that Suad mentioned at the beginning are also not new. And I do want to say that, in 1961, the tax court held that avoiding complicity under the Nuremberg principles as a war criminal did not justify A.J. Muste, the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and one of the great nonviolent activists of the 50s and 60s, in refusing to pay his income tax over the development and testing of nuclear weapons. And the same argument was made in the 70s over the Vietnam War, where there were good arguments that the Vietnam War was unconstitutional, that war crimes were being committed in the weapons that were being used in the widespread civilian deaths in Vietnam, and people claiming that they had, under international law, a right and even a duty to avoid complicity that included refusing to pay taxes. Those arguments have been considered and absolutely universally rejected in every court decision in which they've come up. I'm not saying that the argument is not theoretically correct, or that a person might not rely on it, but I think I have a responsibility, because I know this to be true, to say so about the precedents that exist. And with that, I think we ought to devote as much time as we can to trying to address questions and answers.
Okay,
Unless Lincoln
um,
wants to comment on what I just said.
This
No.
has been really, really useful. I want to thank all of you. Before we get into the Q&A, I just want to say that we're going to reserve it about 10 minutes at the end for the subcommittee, the Palestine subcommittee, to discuss follow-up about where we can go from here. And as far as the questions, I would urge people to make them general and not specific to your personal filings.
Well,
As much
we
as
also may be able to generalize a personal question, so don't want to scare people off.
I just wanted to start out by asking the two of you if there's been more interest expressed this year because of what's happened, the genocide, the war crimes being committed in Gaza, than you've noticed expressed in the last few years, certainly since Afghanistan and Iraq.
It's the most that I've seen since I've been a war tax resistor. I get the sense that it's the highest interest we've seen in war tax resistance since the Vietnam War. Even just in visits to our website, any given year we might have 40, it's usually around 40,000 unique individuals visit our website and look at about 9 pages. And now we've been averaging about 20,000 plus unique visitors looking at 9 pages every month. So it's just a huge increase. I mean, if normally in the past I might have got a couple calls a week and a few emails about general questions, and I got 3 calls today and probably 10 emails. And the requests for 101s, there's a group of medical professionals for Palestine that I spoke to one of their 101s. They had a session similar to this for folks in the healthcare industry who want to do no harm.
By 101, you just mean a basic introduction to the subject.
Yeah. Thank you. A basic introduction to the subject. So, we've been doing 101s and having 100 plus people usually at every session, and we've been invited to groups that usually have more than 100 people. So all to say, yes, the interest is just really great.
And I'm very confident in saying that Newtrick does not have a lot of competitors in this space, and there is no person in America more knowledgeable on this subject than Lincoln.
Okay, so you want to open it up? Charlotte, do you want to go ask?
Sure, we have gotten a number of questions in the Q&A. Some of them do seem to be kind of particular to a person's situation, but I'm just going to edit those questions to generalize them out a little bit. Now we've had a few questions about foreign held bank accounts and foreign income and what this means. So I'm just going to bring these together to ask you. You may not have a full answer, but this has been several people have chimed in with questions about this. So one is to ask what risks are associated for Americans living abroad who don't file their FBAR, the annual report to the Department of Treasury, on foreign held bank accounts. And we've also received the questions about the foreign earned income exclusion, or the FEIE, which allows people who move overseas to write off about $128,000 in taxes every year. With the note that obviously you have to be overseas to do this, but it did seem to be an effective way to defray federal income taxes legally. And so these were just 2 of the questions that had come in regarding, specifically Americans living overseas, living abroad, and how they can engage in war tax resistance and what the potential risks are.
I'll admit I know nothing about if you don't file the filing about foreign held bank accounts.
Yeah. So because it's harder for the IRS to collect from a foreign account, there is a domestic law that requires the reporting of and disclosing of Americans having foreign bank accounts. And this form is a foreign bank account reporting form, FBAR. And I can just say there has been a giant upsurge in FBAR enforcement in the last couple of years because, and wherever you see an upsurge in IRS enforcement, it's because there is a concern that they've detected a weak spot in their system that they need to shore up. And a lot of enforcement is designed to collect, but also to deter by creating concern and fear and awareness that you can get caught. A lot of IRS enforcement is designed not so much to get the person being enforced against, but to get other people to fear being enforced against and to comply. And that FBAR certainly seems to be like that.
Thank you so much. And there's a couple of other questions that have come in kind of about the political aspects of prosecution and penalties when it comes to war tax resistance. Particularly, I think these questions are resonating in the current environment where, for example, many students on campuses have come under severe sanctions because of their protesting for Palestine. People have lost their jobs. So within this context, there's a question about, are there personal or political biases by IRS agents that can affect positively or negatively the penalties or frequency of identifying and prosecuting or in other ways penalizing war tax resistors? And similarly and relatedly, how much influence do political changes, such as in presidential administrations or leadership in Congress, have in assessing the penalties that are levied against war resistors, considering the varying policies and political leanings of presidential administrations and kind of their own interests in pursuing these policies?
I'd be very interested in whether Lincoln has the same feeling I do, but I think the IRS is one of the least political of all federal agencies. They are much more concerned with inferring their enforcement priorities, as I try to do, because they won't talk openly about them. I think they are much more interested in honesty and transparency than in what the political viewpoint might be behind the person who is either being honest on the one hand or dishonest on the other. And they really were burned in the Nixon administration, which tried to be political, back in the 70s. And I think that has stuck. I do not see them persecuting one political line of thinking over another, but rather having pretty consistent priorities about the way people behave, the tactics they use, and the level of honesty that they are exercising.
And I essentially agree with everything Peter said. Another huge difference.
Maybe with one exception, that I think people that are overtly religious in their motivation are the least likely to be prosecuted, as compared with non-religiously motivated political action of the same kind.
I would add that one huge difference between the 70s and now is that in order for someone to actually get someone assigned to their case, the computer algorithm has to flag that situation. And so there's the bias really, well, the bias is either in the computer program or once someone actually gets assigned the case, but we haven't noticed any bias. I think there's a lot more research to show that there's racial bias in how the computer program's written when it comes to things like who's audited for the earned income credit. But we haven't seen a bias against war tax resistors. And when it comes to different administrations, especially recently, again, echoing Peter, I haven't seen any bias with enforcement. It's the different presidential administrations has usually just led to a difference in how well funded the IRS is.
It's to the benefit of everyone who doesn't pay taxes for whatever reason that the ultra conservatives seem to be against the IRS for completely idiotic reasons, because the more money that's spent on them, the more money the government makes.
Thanks so much. Another question that's come in talks about, are there any heightened risks for war tax resistance for people who are non-citizens of the United States or have an open immigration case, for example, green card holders or sponsoring spouses? Are there risks of deportation, incarceration by ICE, negative decisions in an immigration case, etc.?
Do you know this, Lincoln?
Uh,
I've heard it said, and I know that our non-citizen, we have a lot of non-citizen spouses of American citizen tax resistors in the network, and the non-citizen spouses tend not to get involved, with the tax resistance and file separately. So I assume there must be, but I don't actually know what they are.
it isn't a as common situation where we have actual situations of what's happened to folks, but in our limited experience with that, it seems that it could affect someone's application to be a citizen. They may look at payment of taxes. There was a situation in the past where someone who was legally here, who was not paying federal income taxes, left the country to visit home. And when they came back, before they were allowed back in, they happened to check to see if there had been payment of federal income taxes, and they were not allowed back in the country. So there definitely is heightened risk. It'd be worth talking to an immigration lawyer, though, to know what the current laws are, because that's a changing landscape that I'm less familiar with. As Peter mentioned, that there definitely are folks who are in marriages where there might be a spouse who's not a citizen and they filed separately. That can be more complicated if you're in what's known as a community property state. The IRS might not realize it or pay it as close attention, but technically if you're in a community property state, it doesn't matter if you file separately. Any debts or assets.
That's on the collection side, what you're saying.
Yes, it's on the
Right.
collection side.
But in terms of penalties and liability, if you're not participating and you file separately, you're not liable for penalty for the spouse's conduct.
Okay.
I can answer this just for a second.
Please.
The one caveat I'll say is this is not legal advice. You definitely need to be speaking to an immigration attorney and not take what I say as the gospel on this. But there are specific filing requirements if you are in immigration processes in the United States. In particular, if you are applying for citizenship, you have to be paying your taxes, and your citizenship application is unlikely to be successful if you owe taxes or you have failed to file. Same for the green card process. Whether you're applying under a marriage and trying to remove conditions on your green card or renew your green card, you have to provide your tax filings for the prior years along with your application for your green card. And so failure to file taxes or failure to pay your tax bill or tax penalties can certainly have a negative impact on immigration decisions on your case. So that is certainly something that if you plan to participate in war tax resistance, that you definitely need to be thinking about, and also discussing with your immigration attorney before taking any action.
Thanks so much for that, Leah. I think that sounds exactly right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for joining us as well. And I think you're probably going to stay up for this next part of the conversation. We do have a number of outstanding questions, but it also has been identified that we need to have some follow-up discussion as well. So perhaps we can also follow up with some of these questions over email. We do have the email addresses of everyone who's registered for this event, and we will be sending out the email. So I do want to pass it back to Audrey and perhaps invite Leah to come back up to lead the discussion on next steps for the NLG, specifically the Palestine subcommittee, but also the NLG as a whole in terms of war tax resistance and genocide tax resistance.
This was good timing because for some reason my computer went off.
Lincoln, do you want to post an email? Do you want to post an email for questions, Lincoln? And then if you think any ought to be forwarded to me, you can do that.
I can do that.
Yeah. And if it's all right, I'm going to withdraw from the discussion now.
Sure. Sure.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank
How many-
you. This
How
was
many did we have at
fantastic.
the, how many did we have at the highest point?
About 140.
About 130.
Great, wonderful. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you. Okay, folks.
Audrey, I don't know if you want to go or you want me to talk about next steps.
Yeah, go ahead.
at all? Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
my name's Leah. I'm a co-chair of the Palestine Subcommittee for the National Lawyers Guild. On behalf of the subcommittee, I do want to thank everyone for joining. There were several questions we didn't get to, and many of them were related to the ongoing conflict, not a conflict, I'm sorry, the ongoing genocide that's happening in Gaza and other efforts that are related to tax resistance that we could be taking, in particular from the context of mutual aid. We would like to continue this discussion. If you are part of our subcommittee, you know of our listserv. Suad also mentioned the email address for our listserv at the beginning of this. We'll also put it back in the chat so you can engage more in this conversation there. And we will have our next subcommittee meeting this month. I believe it will be next week. So if you are part of our subcommittee, we would like to, continue this conversation and see if we should have any sort of follow-up event as well. I'll also try to take the remaining questions in the Q&A and see if we can provide some of those responses in a blast email to all people who registered for the event as well. Thank you for coming.
The thing is that the next subcommittee meeting is very close to the filing deadline. So I just figured that we may have some ideas on how to reach out to people and know that we're ready to help out, and probably if we'll be directing a lot of questions to Nutrix and to Lincoln if we're unable to solve it. But where do we go from here? Where does the subcommittee, the Guild, the International Committee, the Guild go from here in letting the movement know that we're ready to help out? If people have ideas. Or if not, maybe this is something that we can discuss online with once people have digested what's happened here.
So one of the questions that came in actually was, there's two questions that I think might be helpful, and maybe it would be good even for Audrey and Suad and Leah to weigh in on this in addition to Lincoln, which is a question that just came in about, sharing more about the subcommittee's goals, because people throughout the Guild have registered for this webinar, and it might be great for them to hear a little bit more about what the subcommittee is and what it's doing and how people can get involved, as well as one of the questions that came in earlier was about, people who are involved in local mutual aid organizations and other kinds of work in their communities. So how can they help to support their communities in engaging in war tax resistance? So those were a couple of the things that I think are relevant to this conversation, because, one of the things the subcommittee does, right, is a lot of movement support work. So where, maybe something about movement support kind of fits into that view as well.
Okay.
I would just add, there was a comment about students on campus and high school needing support. The subcommittee is planning a workshop for faculty members and non-faculty members to support their students in fighting for justice for Palestine. So if you're interested in helping to be a part of this workshop, please do reach out to the subcommittee, and you can certainly be on the planning team for this workshop.
Yeah, just in general, and I'm sure they can contribute afterwards. This subcommittee has done all kinds of things. We organize webinars, we organize delegations to Palestine, write reports on it. We discuss the international law implications in Palestine. We're open to any suggestions that people making. We're thinking of having a webinar with the special rapporteur on the Palestinian rights, Francesca Albanese, who's had fantastic, is probably one of the bravest special rapporteurs, and one has had one of the probably the most impact. So that's the kind of things that the subcommittee is doing. It would be great to organize a delegation once this genocide stops. Not so much to Gaza, but I imagine that we won't be let in. But we've had delegations in the past, and now would be a great time to have a delegation go, if people can get in.
Yeah, I think to orient kind of the strategy and purpose of the Palestine subcommittee, the one thing I'll say, I think that this is an active question. I think that the subcommittee it's always going to be what people are willing to contribute. And so, we always welcome our membership at the Guild to join the subcommittee and attend our meetings and really get involved with us, because it is certainly not a hierarchical space and we really are as strong as our membership. And so I highly encourage people to start to engage with the committee more. That said, we have been heavily engaged with helping to coordinate legal support for activists and student activists who have been persecuted for their activism, particularly over the past 6 months. We're currently in conversations about how we can do that better and fill some of the gaps that clients are feeling when it comes to trying to access legal support. The extreme influx of censorship over the past 6 months for those who are speaking out about Palestine, whether it be on campuses or in the workplace in particular, have been quite extreme, and many people are looking for support and resources. That said, the Guild is incredibly strong in our student membership. And so the subcommittee is also incredibly interested in getting more engaged with our student chapters at law schools across the country, because we recognize not only are students really at the forefront of a lot of our activism and organizing, but also they have a lot of the legal skills that are needed right now to build capacity that our lawyers who are licensed to practice are straining under right now. So really understanding how we can leverage our student membership to provide the legal resources to clients who are really desperate for representation or legal advice at the moment. So I think this is a major area that the subcommittee has been thinking about and focusing on and trying to increase our capacity for. And as Audrey mentioned, in addition to that, we've been running many events over the past 6 months and prior to that as well, not only on war tax, but even last year, we actually had invited the special rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, to do a panel with Dylan, I can't remember his last name right now, which is so bad, but he's, yes, from PA Legal, Dylan Saba from PA Legal. That was a really interesting conversation about the international humanitarian legal framework, but also the grassroots legal movement in the United States, and where do these things come together, and how can these things support one another. As Audrey mentioned, I'm in contact with the Special Rapporteur's office, and we hope to have an event with her to present her report that just came out publicly last week called Anatomy of a Genocide, to present that to our guild and understand, like, where are we headed when it comes to the international legal framework? What purpose is that framework serving? And how can we leverage the report that is now public in our legal work and representation as activist lawyers? We are open to all ideas and very much eager to hear from many people about what they would like to see come out of the subcommittee. But again, I would say we're always only as strong as the labor that people are willing to put into bringing those ideas to fruition. So certainly eager to have more people join us in this work and have the commitment of people to kind of continue to contribute to this work, and forever grateful and acknowledging that every NLG member is engaged in solidarity work, whether on Palestine or any other social justice issue in your own communities and through your legal practice. And so we certainly don't want to act like that's not happening just because we don't necessarily know about it all of the time. And so also just thank everyone not only for coming here, but being who you are in your communities and bringing this work forward in a really impactful way. You're muted, Audrey.
Audrey, we cannot hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. There was just a question about how you become a guild member. You go to our website, www.nlg.org, and sign up. You can do it all online. Once you become a member, joining the Palestine subcommittee is free to everyone. So we hope that you will all join. I think we're getting towards the end of this. I want to thank everybody for joining, and our speakers were fantastic. Thank you, Swad. Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you, Peter. It's no longer there. And let's go out. Let's go out to the street and continue to protest to end the genocide in Gaza. Thank you all.